Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. I would like to welcome all the participants of PAEE 2020 to this keynote session. It's going to be delivered by Dr. Cynthia Finelli from University of Michigan in the United States. Dr. Cynthia Finelli is Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, Professor of Education, and Director of Engineering Education Research at University of Michigan. In her research, she focuses on increasing faculty adoption of evidence-based instruction. Dr. Finelli is a fellow of the American Society of Engineering Education, Deputy Editor for the Journal of Engineering Education, Associate Editor for the IEEE Transactions on Education, and member of the Governing Board of the Research in Engineering Education Network. She founded the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching in Engineering at University of Michigan in 2003 and served as its director for 12 years. Dr. Finelli earned the PSE, MSE, and PhD degrees in electrical engineering from University of Michigan. The title of this keynote session is In Pursuit of Active Learning, Challenges, Insights, and Opportunities. I would like to thank Dr. Finelli for being here with us, and I wish you all a great session, plenty of opportunities for interaction, exchange of ideas, and learning. Enjoy.
Good morning, or I guess good evening to you. I'm Cynthia Finelli, and I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it's currently 9:30 a.m. in the morning. Thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm excited to talk with you. So just to orient you, this is my plan for the next 35 minutes or so. I'm going to start by telling you about my background and who I am. Then I'll spend a little bit of time discussing active learning. And I'll describe some of my research about student resistance to active learning and offer some evidence-based strategies for overcoming it. Finally, I'll wrap up by providing some suggestions for you going forward. So because I have such a unique career path, I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the trajectory that led me to my current role, starting with the early years after I earned my PhD from the University of Michigan in electrical engineering. Through my time as a graduate student, I had very limited teaching experience and no training in pedagogy. I took a tenure track faculty position at Kettering University, and I approached my first course, Circuits 2, using very traditional teaching. I lectured and the students took notes. Everything seemed okay to me. My teaching evaluations were fine and students were scoring well in my exams. But then I attended a week-long teaching workshop, and I dedicated time to focus on my teaching. I heard the research about effective pedagogies, and I discussed strategies for using them with colleagues. I returned home with a new set of tools in my toolbox, and I began applying a more scholarly approach to my teaching. I introduced student teams and active learning and other student-centered teaching in my classroom, and I found that it was more fun for me and for the students. Plus, I could push them to learn the material more deeply. You can see how engaged my students were while working through an example in my circuits class. Over the next several years, I taught almost every EE course in the curriculum using these evidence-based, student-centered teaching approaches. I earned Kettering University's highest teaching award in the meantime. And I started to think about my own teaching and to assess the impact of my innovations and to demonstrate their efficacy to my colleagues, engaging in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or SOTL. I attended education research conferences and pored through journals and textbooks to learn about research designs, social science statistics, and qualitative research methods. And as my inquiries became more sophisticated, my SOTL turned into theory-driven engineering education research. Concurrent with my transition from more traditional research to EER, I became more involved with faculty or professional development, and along the way, I established the Center for Excellence on Teaching and Learning at Kettering University. In 2003, I left my tenured position as Associate Professor of Electrical Engineering at Kettering to rejoin the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan is in Ann Arbor, in the U.S., in the Midwest of the U.S., as you can see in the bottom right here. The university is ranked as the #1 public U.S. university by the QS World University Rankings. And there are 19 schools and colleges, including the College of Engineering. The university has over 6,000 tenured and tenure-track faculty, over 400 of whom are in engineering. And there are 17,000 graduate students and 31,000 undergraduate students at the University of Michigan. In 2003, I was recruited to the University of Michigan to establish and direct the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching in Engineering. This is a partnership between the College of Engineering and the university-wide teaching center, and it focuses specifically on engineering faculty and TAs. I like to use this spectrum to describe the audience of programs for the teaching center. It ranges from instructors engaged in effective teaching and scholarly teaching to those pursuing SOTL and engineering education research. Under my direction, CRLT in engineering operated through a two-part mission. First, it provided faculty and TA professional development to promote the adoption of research-based teaching practices and meet the needs of instructors at the practice end of the spectrum. But it also provided resources and support for instructors on the research end, those pursuing engineering education research, as well as those at the SOTL intersection. And through my career, I've reflected often on this spectrum of practice and research. So let me now tell you about the most recent chapter in my career involving our formal engineering education research program. About 6 years ago, our dean created 5 tenure lines in engineering for faculty embedded within traditional engineering departments to do engineering education research as their main form of scholarship. In 2015, I was hired as the first one of these faculty. So now I sit side by side with my colleagues in electrical engineering and computer science. I teach our introductory circuits and signals and systems classes. I serve on the executive committee and the undergraduate curriculum committee for my department, and I attend and contribute at regular faculty meetings. But my research focus is in engineering education research. Then, over the course of the next 2 years, I was joined by 5 other colleagues. Today, our EER program is small but growing. Last year, we had 5 core EER faculty who are mentoring 5 PhD students. And next week, I'm excited that we're going to be welcoming 3 new students to our program. Okay, so enough about me. Let me take a few minutes now to introduce the idea of active learning. I've been working as a faculty developer and an engineering education researcher for almost 30 years, and I've been striving to influence faculty teaching practices. In that time, I've heard a lot of concerns about using active learning. For example, I've heard things like, if traditional lecturing is working well, why should I risk alienating students by using new teaching practices? What teaching approaches will really make a difference in student learning? I can't do it all. It's just totally overwhelming. I wish I knew more about what my colleagues are doing. I'm going to need ongoing support if I try something new. How will I know if my teaching approach is working? In my discussions with faculty, I always start with a basic definition of active learning, and the one I like most is this one. Active learning is students doing anything in class to learn material other than listening to the instructor lecture and take notes. There are a lot of kinds of active learning that fall into this category, and some of those are arranged on this spectrum by complexity and classroom time commitment. They range from lectures with activities interspersed, which is a fairly simple form of active learning, to think, pair, share exercises, where you ask students to take a minute to reflect on an activity, pair up with a neighbor and share, to more complex student-focused activities like problem-based learning. So why use active learning? Well, one reason is simply to keep student attention. This curve shows the relationship between percent of students paying attention and the time since the start of lecture. You can see from the precipitous drop-off that the attention span of students varies, and after about 15 or 20 minutes, you've basically lost students. So even if you're super fascinating, students will only remember the first 15 minutes of what you're saying. So besides the notion of just waking students up, there's also empirical evidence that active learning has many, many benefits. For instance, a well-cited recent meta-analysis of almost 650 peer-reviewed papers clearly demonstrates the large and consistent impacts to be had by active learning. The failure rate for active learning courses in the meta-analysis is significantly and consistently almost 15% lower than that for lecture classes. And there's a clear shift in the distribution of student scores on concept inventories, indicating greater learning gains for students in active learning courses. In an essay responding to this meta-analysis, Nobel Prize winner Carl Wyman noted that this meta-analysis makes a powerful case that any college or university that's teaching its STEM courses by traditional lecturing is providing an inferior education to its students. So there's a lot of very compelling evidence. But in spite of this overwhelming research evidence, adoption of active learning is slow, and lecturing is still the dominant teaching method at many institutions. One study about active learning among engineering faculty shows that 35% have tried at least 3 strategies but stopped using them, and only 26% are high users of multiple active learning strategies. And in the largest ever observational study involving undergraduate STEM education, researchers observed more than 700 STEM courses at 25 North American universities, and they found that 55% of STEM classroom interactions consisted mostly of conventional lecturing. Another 27% featured interactive lectures that had students participating in some group activities or answering multiple choice questions with handheld clickers, and just 18% emphasized a student-centered style heavy on group work and discussions. My research aims to bridge this research to practice gap by promoting the adoption of active learning. Specifically, my research examines the relationships between faculty teaching and student learning, and I ask questions like, how can we foster and measure student development? What can faculty do to improve student success? What strategies can faculty use to increase diversity in engineering? Why do students resist faculty's use of active learning? And how can we promote more widespread use of active learning and other effective teaching practices? In my research, I've explored factors that influence faculty's adoption of active learning, and I've identified several key motivators that would encourage faculty to change their teaching and use more active learning. These include situating the national research in the local context to provide credible research evidence, providing personalized support as faculty learn about and practice evidence-based teaching practices, finding ways to emphasize how using active learning can improve the student experience, integrating a formal networking and community building aspect into activities designed to help instructors use active learning, and establishing a safe environment for participants to know and learn. These are important motivators to keep in mind as we think about ways to promote broader adoption of active learning. I've also identified many barriers to faculty's adoption of active learning. For instance, the research-based reward structure and the way that teaching evaluations are used often disincentivizes time spent to improve teaching. In addition, the research evidence that demonstrates the powerful impact of student-centered teaching is often inaccessible to faculty. Other barriers include the time required both to plan for the activity and to facilitate the activity in class, the physical limitations imposed by most classrooms, and the instructor's lack of confidence, and the perception of student resistance. I've identified ways to overcome some of these barriers, for instance, by designing and studying flexible classroom spaces and creating faculty learning communities to incentivize faculty change. And more recently, I've turned my attention to student resistance. Student resistance to active learning, or more accurately, instructors' fear of student resistance, is one of the most common barriers that faculty cite to the adoption of active learning. I'm one of the lead PIs on a team looking at issues related to student resistance. We established our multi-institutional team of researchers in 2012, and as you can see, we come from across the country. Our research has been funded through several National Science Foundation grants, and the main questions we ask are, why do students resist active learning, and what can instructors do to overcome that resistance? We've collected a lot of data from multiple kinds of sources to answer that question, including instructor interviews and focus groups and surveys, student focus groups and surveys, classroom observations, and more recently, a systematic review of the literature about active learning. In our work, we've found that there are a lot of ways that students can respond to active learning. Of course, students can respond in positive ways, and the way we hope they'll respond is by being actively engaged in the exercise. But students can also respond in negative ways. In our discussions with faculty, we found that instructors are most afraid that students will respond by expressing open and confrontational resistance. But they're also worried about other types of resistance, ranging from talking with classmates about something unrelated, to being distracted by something else, and even sleeping. Fear of students responding in these negative ways can indeed pose an intimidating barrier to adoption of active learning. And our team has embarked on research to help identify ways to diminish this resistance. We began by collecting concrete evidence about the ways that students can respond to active learning, and we found that the student response can encompass both attitude, how students feel about the activity and if they like it, and their actual behavior. Attitudes can take the form of the value students place on an activity and how positively they feel about it, both of which are important in motivating student learning. Behavior, the response we honestly care more about sometimes, also takes many forms. Are the students actually participating? Are they distracted or distracting others? And ultimately, how are they evaluating the course and the instructor at the end of the term? These two categories of student response, attitude and behavior, are obviously interrelated, and we've applied these categories in our work as we've studied student response to active learning. In our work, we found that active learning responses are mostly positive. For example, during our classroom observations, we were keeping an eye out for the types of student resistance and confrontational behavior that instructors fear most, and we rarely saw it. We more often saw passive resistance, as we sometimes observed students who were distracted or talking to their neighbor about something that seemed unrelated. But the most common response that we observed was active participation by students. So our observations showed that student response is mostly positive, and we followed this up with a student survey that reinforced many of our observational findings. This graphic shows how students responded when an instructor asked them to engage in active learning. Note that the most common type of response was active participation, where the average score was almost 4.0 on a scale of 5. So students pretty much agreed that they would participate when an instructor asked them to engage in active learning. Students also agreed that they would see value in the activity and that they would feel positively about the activity. And they disagreed that they would be distracted. Finally, they also agreed that they would evaluate the course and instructor as excellent if the instructor used active learning. So by and large, students say they're participating and we observe them participating. So that's really good news. But we did see some resistance. And since even small pockets of student resistance can be discouraging, we wanted to identify ways to lower that resistance and promote even more engagement among students. So we've looked at all kinds of things that might influence student resistance. And to guide our work, we came up with a conceptual model that looks at several different factors that might influence resistance. Our model hypothesizes that whether and how students resist active learning depends in large part on characteristics of the student, instructor, or course, on the type of active learning being implemented, and on how an instructor explains and facilitates active learning in the classroom. Surprisingly, as it turns out, the first category of factors in our model represents non-significant predictors of student resistance, including the gender of the student, the gender of the instructor, the student's expected grade, and class size. We also found that type of active learning instruction used doesn't significantly predict student resistance. And our research showed that the most significant predictors of student resistance involve the third category in our model, instructors' behavior during teaching. These include things like the way an instructor introduces the activity and describes its purpose, and how the instructor works to promote engagement and keep the activity running smoothly. Both of these things significantly influence student resistance. So the things that we don't really have control over, such as the characteristics of the course or the students or the instructor, don't really seem to influence student resistance. So that's good news. But the way the instructor explains active learning and facilitates it are significant predictors of whether the student will participate, be distracted, and evaluate the instructor and course highly. And we as instructors have total control over these actions. So let's dig more deeply into these strategies, starting with explanation. In our research, we define explanation strategies as ways that the instructor engages with the class, how the instructor introduces the activity and describes its purpose. That is, how the instructor sets the stage in the classroom before they begin an active learning exercise. These include things like explain why you're using active learning, discuss how the activity relates to active learning and student learning, describe how it relates to graded assignments, and outline specifically what you expect students to do for the activity. It's important to think about what you're going to do to get the students to buy into active learning. Now let's turn to facilitation strategies, which we define as how the instructor promotes engagement and keeps the activity running smoothly once it's begun. So these are things that you're doing while the activity is going on. In our research, we found that these strategies are even more highly correlated with lower student resistance than explanation strategies. So using facilitation strategies will be an even bigger bang for your buck in teaching. These strategies include things like avoid checking your mail or your phone. Walk around the room to assist students who seem stuck. Approach students who are not participating. Invite student questions and adopt an approachable demeanor. Lead a debrief or report out as a whole class activity following the active learning, and give students points based on their participation in the activity. So be thoughtful about how you're going to promote active learning engagement while the activity is happening. Finally, I want to describe a third category of planning and feedback strategies. When we created our survey instrument, we focused on strategies we could observe during a normal class period, but we didn't include things like planning activities that an instructor might do outside of the classroom. But through other data collection, like our instructor interviews and our literature review, we did identify several additional planning and feedback strategies related to how an instructor plans for the activity, assesses its success, and uses feedback to improve the activity for next time. The impact of planning and feedback strategies is clearly important, and they include things like design the activity to connect with the rest of the class period, intentionally plan activities that involve everyone's participation, use student feedback to improve the activity, and reflect on what did and did not work, using that in the next iteration of the activity. So these are the strategies. They're pretty straightforward. None of them is overly complicated or difficult to implement. And using them intentionally can lower student resistance and improve student engagement. So this is the main takeaway I hope that you get from today's session. Think about ways to be thoughtful in introducing the activity and describing its purpose using these explanation strategies. Plan for ways to promote engagement and keep the activity running smoothly using these facilitation strategies that I outlined. And finally, plan for the activity, assess its success, and use feedback to continually improve it by relying on these planning and feedback strategies. So let me return to the common faculty concerns I posed at the beginning of this session. If traditional lecturing is working well, why should I risk alienating students by using new teaching practices? Well, hopefully the answer to that is fairly clear. These new teaching practices will make a difference in student learning. What teaching practices will really make a difference in student learning? Well, my answer to that is active learning. Use student-centered teaching approaches like think, pair, shares, interactive lecturing, and even problem-based learning to improve student learning in your classroom. What about the instructor that says, I can't do it all, it's overwhelming? I completely agree with you on this, and my recommendation is don't try to do it all. Take bite-sized pieces and approach the active learning exercises in ways that are feasible for you to implement. I don't really know what my colleagues are doing is another common concern, which I recommend you could address by talking with your colleagues, opening the doors to your classroom, building collaborations with your friends and colleagues across the hall, and thinking about, as a team, what you can do to affect student learning and use active learning in your classroom. I'm going to need ongoing help if I'm going to try something new. Well, my recommendation in that case is to partner with your Center for Teaching and Learning. Find faculty professional developers, whether they're on your campus or across the country, or maybe even an international partnership that you can establish to get that ongoing support you need. Find webinars and other online resources that might help you address some of your concerns in an ongoing way. And how will I know if my new approach is working? Again, this is another common concern that I've heard from faculty, and my recommendation is to get feedback. Ask your students if they think the approach is working. Step back periodically and reflect yourself on how the session went. Ask your colleagues to help you out and provide some input on what's happening in the classroom. And even think about using scholarship of teaching and learning as a mechanism for you to collect more systematic feedback and study your teaching in a more advanced way. This could even lead to publications that you might be able to publish that would get even more interest from other faculty colleagues that you're working with. So finally, what can you as faculty do to be proactive about active learning? What can you do to leverage the research I presented here in response to the questions I just posed? First, start small and simple. Make incremental changes. If you mostly lecture, sprinkle a few easy to implement active learning strategies into your course. Be realistic about what you can accomplish and how much you can expect to invest in your teaching. It's much better to be successful with small efforts than to be unsuccessful with larger efforts. Use active learning early in the term to get your students used to it. Explain to them why you're using it and implement active learning often. I recommend doing it every day. Explain the purpose that you have for using active learning to your class. Practice these explanation strategies. Share the research benefits and let students know that you really do expect this to help them be more successful. Deliberately apply the facilitation strategies to help your students be more engaged during the active learning. I know it can sometimes be uncomfortable to maybe walk around the class and interject into a conversation where it looks like the students are getting off course. But our research has shown that using these facilitation strategies can make a significant difference in lowering student resistance. Consider collecting student feedback in the middle of the term to hear from them how active learning is going, and then act on that student feedback. Partner with your colleagues and create some networking opportunities. It's much more motivating and fun to work with others who can support your efforts and help you think about the difficulties and celebrate your accomplishments, and who share your passion. And finally, if possible, collaborate with faculty developers who can help provide some ongoing support and be there to promote change as you consider what you're doing in the classroom. So finally, let me leave you with this quote from Wilbert McKeechee. He's a well-known expert in higher education in the US. He says, if there's one thing that the literature agrees on universally, it's the value of involving the learner in the active processing of incoming information. I hope that what you've heard today helps empower you to take action and to adopt active learning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Finelli. And I would like now to start the moment for the questions. Let me see here. We already have a question for you. It's from Wishai Shachinaiwat. In Thailand University, we tend to have big classes, so the resistance is even more and stronger for large classes. How to overcome when we do large classes?
So thanks for that question. I don't know how large is large at Thailand. I teach classes that regularly have 100 to 150 students. Is that the order of the class sizes in Thailand, or is that smaller?
Please, well, Professor Wishai, could you tell us how large is the classes here in the?
Many classes will range from 60 to 80 students, so it's not more than 100. But there are some classes in the general science that we might have more than 100 classes.
So I think that some of the strategies that I outlined will be especially critical in those kinds of classes. It can be harder to get around and be able to speak with all of the students in a large class if you turn them loose, sort of active learning exercise. But I've found it to be very productive, active learning in large classes. Like I say, large classes being over 100. But it's really important to set the stage at the beginning of the semester to let students know why you're doing what you're doing, and to reinforce that throughout the term. So try not to let bits of students in a large class go sort of unmonitored. And I think that you'll find that it's fairly easy to keep them going if you set the stage at the beginning of the semester.
Thank you, Dr. Finelli.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
May I?
Yes, please.
Which of the active learning methods can you recommend us, academic teachers, in the context of pandemic COVID-19 and remote learning?
That's a really good question. Our classes at University of Michigan start on Monday of next week, and I'm teaching a class which is entirely online, so I'm struggling with that exact question right now. And a couple of things come to mind. I've been using or planning to use a lot of breakout rooms, so I'll take the larger class and have students placed into smaller groups where they can work on something active. One thing that I'm planning on doing is having them contribute in groups to a Google document. So I'll pose a question and ask them to come up with some, responses to that question as a group, and to type those responses into this Google document, which then we'll share with the class afterwards. I've also been using some just open discussion conversations, especially using whiteboards. So there are built-in Zoom whiteboards, but there are also a lot of freely available whiteboards. There's one called Google Jamboard, which you can post as a shared screen and have the students contribute to sort of online actively. So they can either post a response on a little Post-it sheet, or they can type an answer in, or they can draw a picture. So somehow contributing to sort of this Google document by typing, or by a shared whiteboard in responding there. One thing that I'm actually planning on doing is giving my students some ownership in regards to this. So I'm going to ask them to plan some virtual in-class activities for specific class sessions. So I'll let them use their creativity. I don't know, do others of you have other brilliant ideas for engaging students with active learning in online classes? Actually, let me say one more thing about that. The research that I showed you in the recorded presentation all had to do with in-class active learning, which was done in person. And that's the focus of a very large research grant that I have with my colleagues right now. But with COVID, we're transitioning our work to studying the impact of online active learning. So we'll be coming up with new measures of student resistance and new strategies for reducing resistance in online courses based on the sorts of things we see going forward in these online environments.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Finelli. I have a few hands up here, and I'm gonna try to follow the order. Professor Roma from Alicante University in Spain, please.
Thank you, Val. First of all, I want to thank for this inspiring presentation. And the problem that I have found is more than the students' resistance, is teacher resistance. So I have colleagues, even young ones, who refuse to change their minds. Connecting this with the previous presentation, they don't want to move to the uncomfortable zone. So from your experience, what do you think would be the most effective way to move them into active learning strategies?
Well, first of all, I think with my experience as a faculty developer trying to really promote change, I've come to realize that there are some faculty who are so resistant to change that I think it's not necessarily worth the effort to try to change everybody. That being said, I also think that there are some really good instructors who do a great job with regular chalk talk lecturing. So first of all, I don't think it's critical that every single person change, but I do think there are some sort of barriers to using active learning that we can reduce by sort of building more community amongst our colleagues. So for the faculty who are sort of on the edge of being convinced that active learning is the way to go, I think things like creating a community of people who are talking about active learning and using different strategies together as a group will be one sort of motivating way to help faculty overcome those barriers. I also think that one of the most difficult things that faculty face is the fact that they perceive that it takes so much time to use active learning because it'll take away class time. So what I really recommend in that case is focusing on some of these straightforward activities that don't really require extra class time, like a think, pair, share, or brainstorming ideas or interactive lecturing. So starting small really can help in that regard. The fact that the literature about what are the positive effects of active learning can be so daunting and overwhelming is another reason that a lot of faculty are resistant to change, because they don't have the time or the motivation to read through all that heavy literature. So if you can somehow boil down the research literature to something that is easy to digest, like that slide I showed, which had the, I think it was 15% less failure rate for instructors that use active learning. If you can boil down the complicated research into these digestible, easy to see facts, that can really help faculty overcome some of these barriers also.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you. Now, Professor Rui Lima from University of Minho.
Hi. Hello, Cindy. Thank you for
Hi.
being here with us and for sharing part of your research. I was picking up on this question from Miguel. I have one question regarding the continuum of categorization of teachers that you showed us at the beginning. And some of your recommendations are for transferring some of the teachers to the evidence part of that classification. But I was thinking about how do you see the distinction between the scholarship of teaching and learning and engineering education research when you think about these teachers?
So that's a really good question. So reflecting on the spectrum that I showed, which had effective teaching on the farthest left side, and then scholarly teaching, and then scholarship of teaching and learning, and then engineering education research. I think faculty fall all along that spectrum. And I think that it's a little bit misleading to show scholarship of teaching and learning and engineering education research as distinctly different blocks, because they blend together a lot. I think it's hard to distinguish the kinds of data collection and work that describes what is scholarship of teaching and learning from that which is more rigorous engineering education research. So I sometimes hesitate to classify faculty scholarship as one of those two categories. One thing that sort of makes engineering education research stand apart is the fact that some places provide PhDs in engineering education research. Some faculty use this as their only scholarship. It's really grounded in strong theoretical principles and sort of branches out beyond a single classroom. So I think helping interested faculty learn about different ways to investigate what's happening in their classroom by administering validated student surveys, for instance, and then sharing some of the findings with their faculty colleagues next door. I think that's a good way to introduce faculty to this idea of studying what you're doing. And then what I have found that is, in some cases, faculty sort of continue in this cycle of studying what they're doing, changing their practice, sharing it with colleagues, doing more of the same, and sort of stay in this scholarship of teaching loop, which is fabulous because it's improving what's happening in the classroom. But sometimes faculty collaborations get built and faculty learn more about the field of engineering education research, and they move farther along into the space of engineering education research. And that's fabulous too, but it's really sort of two different kinds of paths. And I think both have a lot of benefit and value for the faculty engaged in them and for the institutions that they're working in as well. I don't know if that answers your question. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Diana Mesquita from University of Minho, please.
Oh, thank you, Professor Cindy. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting with a lot of inputs and insights. I have a lot of questions, but I choose just one. And it's regarding to your study and your research, and in terms of the perceptions of students regarding what active learning means. So for them, in your perspective, and according to your data, how do students understand the active learning approaches? And in each order, this could influence their responses and so on in your study. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I should also mention that I'm happy to follow up with any of you. If you have other questions, feel free to email me. My email is cfinelli@umich.edu. So if we can't get to all of your questions, I'm happy to answer those offline. But this is one thing that we found as a disconnect for students and faculty. We've done a lot of data collection where we've tried to triangulate our findings to confirm that what one source of data tells us is similar to what another source of data tells us. And the idea about what constitutes active learning is one place where we found a mismatch. So for faculty, we were able to be pretty explicit and say, when you use this kind of teaching practice, tell us how you think students respond. But for students, if we said, how often does your instructor use this kind of teaching practice? It didn't match with what the faculty member said. So as I say, there's a bit of disconnect. So the way we've gotten around that is in our student surveys, we ask, instead of telling us about how you responded in the time this faculty member did this thing, we say, when your instructor does something like have you work in a small team or do a think, pair, share, tell us how likely you are to respond in each of these different ways. So we've had to think carefully about how we phrase those questions to get around that issue. But we do find a lot of coherence in a particular class about how students respond in that sort of more generic active learning situation.
Thank you. Now we have, I think it's our last question from Professor Diniz Carvalho from University of Minho, please.
Hi, I don't know if it's too late because now I think it's 2 minutes past 3:30. I don't know if it's acceptable.
Yes, it's acceptable because I talked to the organization and we are going to have a little spare time.
Okay, I'm sorry, Cindy. You are having a lot of questions to answer.
Fine, I'm happy to answer them.
I'm sorry about that.
That's the
of
best
course,
part.
Of course, I believe in active learning. I try to actually promote it, but in your study is, I think, more interested in knowing how the students see that, how they get motivated and how they accept that. But one thing that I think we should have in order to have stronger arguments to implement and to active learning is to measure how they are effective in terms of building skills. And maybe I don't know, I didn't find anything about that, but do you know any study that actually shows objectively the effect of active learning in the effectiveness of building skills, either technical skills or professional skills? Is there any study that shows some evidences of that effectiveness?
So there have been a lot of studies about the positive impacts of active learning. Some of them have used concept inventories as a way to assess student knowledge and understanding. In the meta-analysis data that I provided earlier showed a compilation of data from published studies using concept inventories. That's not exactly the same thing as skills, but it sort of drills down to the level of whether the active learning approach results in greater conceptual understanding. And across the board, there's a lot of evidence that it does improve conceptual understanding. The work that I've been engaged in has not been focusing at all on does active learning work, because we feel that that question has been answered in the literature. I can't point to a particular study for you right now that shows that it improves science or engineering skills, but they're out there. I could track some down and forward them to you. But rather, we started with the assumption that active learning does work. So from that, we are investigating these ideas around student response to active learning.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Finelli, for all your answers. Thank you, all the participants, for the questions and for being here with us. Again, we would like to thank Dr. Finelli for this wonderful keynote session. And the local organization would like to present to you a plaque of appreciation. Then I'm gonna pass to them the word.
Thank you. I wish I could be there in person. I'm very sad that I can't be there with you all.
On behalf of the organizations, we would like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Finelli. Okay, and we have the plaque of appreciation to present to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Dr. Finelli, thank you very much again for being here with us. Thank you all the participants, and we are closing this session at this moment.